My name is Professor Belinda Beck. I'm a professor in the School of Health Sciences and Social Work at Griffith University on the Gold Coast and Director of the Bone Clinic in Brisbane. You are listening to the Physical Performance Show, and we are talking about bone stress injuries.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's leading heart rate monitors and GPS watches, and our upcoming live stream event, Fueling the Endurance Athlete with Rinny McGregor. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course we do this across a range of our different episodes: Coaches Corners, Interest Editions, the occasional Learn-Ins Catch-Up episode, Expert Editions, and Featured Performers. Hot off the back of last week's Featured Performer episode featuring Alistair Brownlee, dual Olympic triathlon champion, we shift gears this week and share with you a conversation that I recently had with repeat guest of the show, Professor Belinda Beck. Now, Professor Beck first appeared on the show way back on episode 82 in November 2017, where Belinda discussed all things the health of our bones across our lifespan. And today you'll hear from Professor Beck around all things bone stress injuries in the adolescent athlete. However, there are learnings applicable to everyone, all athletes, from Professor Beck's share-ins today. By way of bio, Professor Beck is an exercise physiologist, world-renowned and revered bone researcher, musculoskeletal anatomist, and self-confessed scientific mythbuster. Belinda is the pioneer and founder of both the Bone Clinic and the award-winning Onero program, an exercise program for osteoporosis. Belinda is prolific in the scientific literature when it comes to the role of exercise and its effect on bone, with Professor Beck's chief work goal being to develop evidence-based, safe and effective management and prevention for musculoskeletal conditions such as osteoporosis, stress fractures, and osteoarthritis. In 2021, Professor Beck co-authored a narrative review titled Risk Factors, Diagnosis and Management of Bone Stress Injuries in Adolescent Athletes. It was co-authored with her colleague, physiotherapist for the Queensland Ballet Louise Drysdale. And it is that paper that forms the framework for our discussion today on all things bone stress injuries in the adolescent athlete. Here is my conversation with Professor Belinda Beck. Professor Belinda Beck, it has been many weeks since you last appeared on the Physical Performance Show, actually way back on episode 82. So we're nearly 200 episodes down the road. Welcome back to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Professor Belinda, we recently featured one of your research assistants and academics from your department there at Griffith University, Amy Harding, for an exploration of all things the Lift More M trial, looking at the positive interactions of exercise in terms of males with low bone density and the great effects that can achieve. Today, we're going to explore a paper that you recently published with colleague Louise Drysdale of Queensland Ballet around all things adolescent bone stress injuries in terms of the diagnosis, management, and risk factors associated with that. So I don't know how you find the time. You are prolific with your output academically.
Well, when you have good students who you pull on board to help you write, that makes things a bit easier. It's a win-win. I'm invited to write something. I pull in a student and send them out to do a lot of background research. They learn about the research at the same time, and then together we put the thing together and they learn good writing skills along the way.
academic writing skills. It's certainly a skill set, one that I don't think I perfected at uni. You might remember some of my assessment items. I'm not sure.
No, I don't remember that, and I'm sure they weren't that bad anyway.
Oh, gosh. Well, the adolescent athlete, Belinda, maybe we start with a definition. What is the definition of adolescence as opposed to, say, childhood?
That's actually a tough question, and I think you'd probably get different answers depending on who you ask. But I think an adolescent is somebody who is a teenager, so from sort of roughly age 12 through to about 17, and that would be stretching. And, of course, because you've got very vast variability in development in those ages, you can have somebody who has very adolescent-like traits when they're even as young as 10, whereas you might have some who are similarly adolescent when they're 19. So, but it's that period there where all the hormones are changing. Growth is very rapid at certain periods. Yeah, there's an awful lot going on, not just physically but mentally.
Yeah, I don't think we can all in some way remember those years. So it's really difficult to wrap numbers around it. It's more of a physical attribute, physiological change season in life as opposed to hard and fast numbers. In terms of bone stress injuries, a simple review of the definition and the underlying mechanisms of a bone stress injury, Belinda.
So a bone stress injury is umbrella term to cover all of the signs and symptoms that are associated with a breakdown in some way of the bone tissue and the surrounding membrane in response to typically overload and repetitive overload. So it may not be a very, very great strain, a very large load, but it might be multiple of those. So we would say the reason I talk about the membrane around the bone is because the periosteum, which covers bone, can get inflamed. And that can be the very mild version of a bone stress injury. And then you can have micro damage, little cracks, tiny cracks, that can then go on to coalesce into a major crack, which would be considered a stress fracture. So there's this big, long continuum of what's considered a bone stress injury.
It's a great point you raised there, Belinda, about the membrane, the periosteum. Can you just sort of wrap a description of what that's actually like in terms of tissues for people that maybe have never had the chance to be in an anatomy lab, a wet lab?
Yeah, so it's just like if you were to visualise it, it actually does look like a wet tissue, basically lying over the top of bone. It has two layers. The outer layer is tough connective tissue. So a lot of collagen fibers, something that's very resilient. It's like a piece of fabric, a tough piece of fabric, and that gives an attachment point for things that attach to bone. But underneath it, there's a layer of cells, and those cells are really, really vital to the health of bone because they often refer to them as progenitor cells. So these are precursors to the bone cells, which are able to become bone cells, and when they do, they can create new bone.
Where does the pain actually come from? So we can get the pain from periostitis or inflammation of that periosteum you just beautifully gave description of, and pain from bone itself. What generates these pain signals?
Well, people tend to think of bone as this sort of inert, hard structure that, if you're a meat eater, you often would see a bone in a chicken and it just looks like a hard thing. But actually, it's a very, very live thing. It is full of canals, and in those canals are blood vessels and nerves. And the nerves are the kinds of nerves that can perceive pain. And so there's always a reason in the body for a structure. And in this case, it seems like having this large number of nociceptors, pain sensory structures in bone allows us to know when we are doing something that's damaging the bone. So we've got this sense inside the actual bone tissue to this ability to perceive pain, and also in the periosteum. Now, anybody who's kicked their shin knows that the periosteum is full of pain receptors. It's a protective mechanism that the body has developed to protect us from doing things that are injurious to bone.
Because, as you say, bone is not inert, dead structure. It's living, it's breathing, it needs to be nurtured. And as we'll discuss today, things can go wrong at times. Belinda, thanks for taking us there for a brief anatomy review. In terms of adolescence, the incidence in athlete populations, the paper Louise and yourself published stated the incidence is somewhere between 3.9 and 19%. But what sort of jumped out to me has been really interesting, particularly as a clinician, is that the recurrence rates are quite high, up to 21% for adolescent bone stress injuries.
Epidemiology of injuries is a really fraught issue. If you get into the literature, you'll notice that there are lots of different numbers. Not everybody finds the same incidence rate or prevalence of a disease or an injury. And that makes it very difficult to really pin down what the real numbers are. So, for example, oftentimes people will write a paper because they're working with a particular group or demographic, and they've noticed that there's a high rate of injury of a particular thing. So they write a paper about that and they report their injury rate. So that is inherently biased data, because the reason why they've written the paper and reported the numbers is because they've noticed something as being particularly high. So it's possible that the rates that are reported in some publications are biased. So this is the same whether it's in adolescent data or in adult data. So that very broad range you saw there, from sort of 1 to 19%, that's a huge variation. And so I think we could probably safely say it'll be somewhere in between those two extremes. But your question about it's interesting that people who have one injury are likely to have another. If you think about it, it actually makes perfect sense, because the reason why they had the first injury is probably still there. And if it's a physical reason, it's the same person, so they're just as likely to re-injure. If it's a behavioural reason and they haven't fixed that behaviour again, it's going to cause it again. It's only the people who manage those issues in some way, and we'll talk about those later, who are able to prevent. And for some people, they may find that the activity that they're doing that's causing the injury is not one that their body is really able to manage. And this is what self-selection is all about. We're all watching the Olympics with absolute fascination at the moment. These athletes that we're watching, they have self-selected into these elite performance positions because they're the ones who have been able to withstand the forces that they've been putting on them as they've been training, these huge loads. Many people have fallen by the wayside because their body can't withstand those forces. So speaking of bias, there's a very biased sample in that Olympic elite demographic. They have the best bodies for withstanding those kinds of forces.
Yeah, great point. And even in that very small segment of the population, the Olympic athletes, their stories are still so often littered with bone stress injuries, particularly running athletes, jumping athletes. So it's still, I guess, something that, even though their robustness is probably far superior than most people, there's still a living, breathing tissue that they still have to navigate.
Absolutely. And as you say, bone stress injuries are rife in elite athletes. And then it starts to go into a question of pain tolerance. And we know that pain is this whole other area. They may be the ones who have this incredible pain tolerance, and they can put up with some of these conditions that happen with the high levels of loading. But of course, in some cases, it's not good to ignore pain at that extent. And so that's why you see those horrendous images of athletes who are sprinting down a stretch and their bone just breaks. And it's because they have a pain tolerance that is so high they've been able to ignore that tibial stress fracture, but ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And so there are some catastrophic failures that make us all just cringe with pain.
Yeah, those horrible manifestations of that. Your colleague and fan of your work from Indiana University, Professor Stuart Warden, recently featured on preventing bone stress injuries in runners, a narrative review he published with some colleagues. And Belinda, one of the subsections is titled "Not All Skeletons Are Created Equal." So I think that's a great extrapolation of what you just shared.
That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly. And, you know, the strength of our bones is pretty much determined by our parents and their parents before them. Genes determine the largest proportion of what makes our bones strong. And it's the same in osteoporosis as it is in bone stress injuries.
And I've read, and once again, statistics, there's bias, no doubt, in there with these reports, but up to 70% of bone health, thereabouts, in other words, a huge component is genetic.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. Yeah. The twin studies show us that environment plays a role, but it is dwarfed in importance by genes. And I often say to people, I can look at two different people, and if they were to start a heavy training program, I could tell you the one that's more likely to injure just by looking at their structure and their body habitus, and particularly looking at the width of their ankles and wrists. You know, people with narrow bones are much more likely to injure than people with these big, thick, robust skeletons.
Is that right? So is that an anecdotal observation, or there's science? Yeah. That's an anecdotal, but you can see narrow wrists, you would conclude from that or be able to project that their skeletal health may be lesser, or?
Yeah, that's a total Belinda air fact. And I discourage people from using that as their diagnostic, but just from years of experience. For example, I've done a bit of work with army recruits, and we've done a lot of measurement at Kapuka, and you'll see a whole platoon, 40 young folks sitting together, and I could essentially go around the room and say, you'll get a bone stress injury, you won't, you will, and you won't, just by looking at their physique. Big, strong, muscly people are less likely to be injured than small, fine-boned people.
I often reflect on some of my clinical experiences over the years in working with high-end triathletes, national representative triathletes around the world with the Super League Triathlon Series, and I often say sometimes their skeletons feel like birds. When you lift a leg, they just feel unbelievably light. And obviously that's beneficial for running fast. But as you say, there's typically a heightened risk of bone stress injury, but they literally feel like birds. Like there's nothing here, light.
Yeah, well, that brings two things to mind for me. Number one, yikes, that's a worry. But number two, isn't the skeleton incredible? If I have an image in my mind from a picture in a book that I read once that has a cross-section of a aeroplane wing and the way it has been engineered to be very, very light but very strong, and the arrangement of the trabecular struts in that wing, and then a cross-section of a vulture bone in their wing. And it's exactly the same. The body has adapted itself to be extremely strong but extremely light for these birds so they can fly easily. Our bones are the same. The reason they're hollow tubes, is because a hollow tube is much stronger than a solid tube that's not as wide. So that's why our bones are hollow. Why it makes more sense. So the problem with triathletes is that they often have been swimmers, competitive swimmers, and it's very beneficial to have a light skeleton as a swimmer. But also, if they train many, many hours and spend a lot of time in the pool, then that unloading of this daily weight-bearing stimulus is also not particularly beneficial. And study way back in the early 90s at Stanford showed this very clearly if they did a comparison between gymnasts, runners, cyclists and swimmers in their varsity team. So these are elite level varsity athletes. And they compared them to controls, inactive controls of the same age. And they found in terms of the bone mineral density, gymnasts were far and away the toughest and strongest bones. And after that, way, way lower down were the runners. The cyclists had bone mass of roughly the same as the controls, the inactive controls, because, of course, cyclists are in a weight-supported environment too. And the swimmers were lower than your average person, inactive person. So, again, there's this issue of self-selection. People with low bone mass are probably better swimmers, but also the fact that they were spending, 6 hours a day in the pool training is actually unloading their skeleton.
Gosh, it's and I know there's a great piece of work yourself and colleague Ben Weeks at Griffith University and maybe some other collaborators have put out. It's the loading index of different sports, and I think that's what you're referring to there, Belinda.
Yeah, that's right. We developed the BPAC, which is a bone-specific physical activity questionnaire, and the purpose of that was because when people were trying to determine how much exercise they should do for their bones, they were using these physical activity questionnaires that were designed for aerobic and metabolic load. And we know that, marathon runners don't have particularly good bones. They're incredibly fit, but that kind of instrument would show fitness, metabolic fitness, but it doesn't show bone fitness. So the bone-specific physical activity questionnaire has algorithms behind the scenes in the calculator we created that weights activities that load the skeleton heavily. And so we can detect or we can estimate how healthy somebody's bone is according to their BPAC score.
And that can be used by, it's more of a clinical academic tool as opposed to something that the public would engage with.
Yeah, well, it's free and, it's available, but it's definitely an academic tool because we don't have massive reference norms. We do have a paper that does have some reference values in there that people could refer to. It's not a very large scale one with, very broad population norms. So probably when I retire, maybe I can do that job.
Add it to the list, Professor Belinda. Belinda, in terms of the risk factors that the review did explore, there's several. Maybe we start with the obvious one that you've already cited, and that is a prior history of bone stress injury risk is perhaps the greatest risk factor for a future bone stress injury. Anything you'd add to that?
The number one cause of a bone stress injury is doing too much too soon. Our bones are phenomenal in that they do adapt to the loads we put on them by becoming either stronger if you're overloading them or weaker. If you go into microgravity into space, you lose bone like crazy, or if you're bedridden or have a cast on a limb, you lose bone. But if we're trying to build bone, we overload them, and our bones can adapt to that and adapt beautifully, not just in mass, but in shape. But the trouble is it takes a while for that to happen. So if you begin a training program and you go from being a couch potato to suddenly running 10Ks every couple of days, you are a bone stress injury waiting to happen. Your bones actually need a full remodeling cycle of bone cells is 4 months, but that new bone needs to be mineralized, and that takes another 6 months on top of that. So really, to load up your bones safely and build yourself into that running three 10Ks a week, you need to start with 1K and gradually progress to that point. Now, it does definitely depend on the person how quickly you can do that, and you just have to listen to your body. If you start getting aches and pains in your bones, then you're doing too much too soon. You need to back right off, let your bones catch up, and they will. It's not an illness. It's just physics and physiology. Your bone cells will catch up and will fix things mostly, but you just have to listen to your body. Mike Fredrickson is an orthopedic surgeon at Stanford, has once upon a time gave me a return to training protocol for somebody who had been injured, and it's a 9-week program to get somebody back to their full training. And so it sounds a bit doom and gloomy, and when I make comments about a 4-month remodeling cycle. That doesn't mean you have to wait 4 months. It just means that you need to do things gradually. And a 9-week return to training seems to suit most people.
Yeah, that's such great information. It's about respecting the physiological processes that are unfortunately invisible. So therefore, sometimes they're not respected and people flare again or set themselves back. And that's certainly, Belinda, really is a great addition to what your colleague Professor Stuart Warden shared around the fact that it can take up to a year to mineralise the bone through after, as you say, a 4-month bone cell remodelling phase. And Professor Stuart brought the point up about periodising bone in terms of workload through the year. And I think one of the mistakes you see it in adolescent athletes, adulthood as well, is just constant year-round, same monotonous loading patterns for bone. Anything you'd add from your experiences specific for the adolescent athlete or the adult population around the importance of trying to periodise workload in a sense of giving deload periods to resensitise the skeleton?
I like that idea. Very difficult to implement perfectly. Possibly in the simplest terms, the best thing to do is to not specialise too early or ever, really. I mean, somebody who does nothing but running will get there, and particularly not everybody injures when they run, mind you. They might be perfectly fine and healthy and running their entire life, but they will get to a point, and reasonably quickly, where their bones have detected the loads from running, have adapted to that, and then they're not going to keep growing. Bones won't keep putting on more bone mass if they're adequately adapted for the exercise you're doing. So if you want to make your bones stronger, you have to do something else. So variety is key. Different kinds of loading. That's why playing hockey, playing tennis, playing volleyball, basketball, squash, things that are applying unusual loads on reasonably hard courts, backwards and forwards, things that require agility, sudden changes of direction. All of that is loading your bones slightly differently from just straight running in a straight line. If you don't like to play a team sport, then add in things like stairs. Do stairs at least once a week. Change the intensity. Maybe do some cutting drills. Just something that changes the direction of the loading. And definitely give your body a break every now and again and just let things catch up. You have to, the minute you feel any pain, that's a definite sign to back right off, do something else. Get in the pool. I know I've said that swimming is not a bone builder, but it's a good way to keep your aerobic fitness up while your bones are just having a bit of a rest and trying to catch up.
That reset of the skeleton, allowing the sensitivity to return, it just makes sense practically, but it can be hard to implement for the driven individual who, for a variety of reasons, may find having a week of not doing their normal routine quite challenging, which certainly me.
Yeah, for sure.
You're listening to Professor Belinda Beck on this expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, sharing around all things bone stress injuries in adolescent athletes. Support for today's show comes from Polar. Polar are a sports technology company who build world-class multi-sport watches and heart rate monitors for people who take their health, fitness and sports performance seriously. Polar have an incredible heritage. Headquartered in Finland, they have been the global driving force behind scientific wearables for over 40 years. They are the pioneers in and the world leaders in heart rate measurement technology, providing you, the athlete, with the best 24/7 measurement. Now, recently the team released a range of high-performance watches, the Polar Grit X Pro watch being the flagship model. For those who like to train outdoors and think of the world as their playground, the Polar Grit X Pro is designed to military-level standards with scratch-resistant sapphire glass and ultra-long battery life, providing ultimate durability for the most demanding situations. Explore the world and live for adventure with the all-new navigation tools, always-on outdoor features, and Polar's ultimate training solutions. The Polar Grit X Pro watch is resistant up to 100 metres, and unrivaled GPS accuracy and Polar Precision wristband OHR tracking makes this the gold standard in outdoor multi-sport watches. And true to Polar's heritage, the Grit X Pro range will come in 3 stunning colours, including Nordic Copper, Arctic Gold, Black Diamond Light Carbon, and the Titan, a premium edition that's ultra strength made from lightweight aerospace titanium. Now, the team have generously offered up to 15% off selected products over at polar.com, but do yourself a favour and check out the Grit X Pro range if you are in the market for a new multi-sport watch. Support for today's show also comes from our upcoming live stream event, Fueling the Endurance Athlete, with leading UK-based sports dietitian and author Rinny McGregor. Tickets are just $49 per person, with all registrants receiving a post-event recording of the live stream and all copies of notes via PDF. It's a fantastic learning opportunity not to be missed by coaches, scientists, practitioners, and of course, the endurance athlete of any level. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Rinny McGregor live stream to secure your ticket today. And finally, support for today's show comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, our online 45-minute telehealth consultations can be a highly effective way to help get you back to your physical best. Here's a success story from Sarah, Tasmanian-based, recreationally competitive triathlete.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a competitive age group triathlete from Australia, and telehealth 100% works. I did telehealth with Brad for chronic sesamoiditis, and I didn't need any hands-on treatment. I had exercise prescription and load management with my training, and this, along with Brad's expertise and genuine care, got me across my pogo finish line.
For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Professor Belinda Beck, founder of the Bone Clinic, sharing around all things bone stress injuries in the adolescent athlete. Belinda, in terms of adolescent athletes, there's this concept of the rate of growth, and there is seemingly a heightened risk through those periods of growth of the bones for these bone stress injuries. Anything you'd add there? It's an interesting concept, this one.
Yeah, it is. And there's not a lot of really good data about it, but there's some suggestion that during a growth spurt, particularly boys have an increased risk of fracture, general fracture of any kind. And it's because the bone has grown in length enormously, but it, as Stuart has mentioned, it's not fully mineralized immediately. So the bone mass is there, but it's not as strong as it can be. So if you're at a period of your life where you're doing a lot of those things that kids tend to do, kick the soccer ball around, or, playing a bit of footy in the lunch hour, or, parkour. My son is obsessed with parkour and, jumping on things and off things and climbing. And that's the time where weaker bones, more risk, the two create a perfect storm, really.
I was thinking you might be happy seeing your son jump off things and land heavily and awkwardly because there is also that positive adaptation. So it's a double-edged sword in some ways, right?
Absolutely. I'm extremely happy. We have a trampoline which he jumps on and then jumps really high and off onto the ground. And, the first couple of times he did it, I cringed. But then I thought, you know what? This is so great for his bones.
Yeah, every other parent's nervously, looking the other way, and bone researchers are looking at it with great joy.
That's right.
So I guess the practical application is not easy, because who knows what the ideal workload is. It's always trial and error, but just be aware if your child's going through that rapid growth phase, then there is likely going to be a heightened risk of bone stress injury.
Yeah, possibly. So, as I say, the data is not good, but there's a reasonable assumption that there probably is a period of weakness. Having said that, if they've got bones that, because they have been so active throughout their life, they're a really great shape, their shape is well adapted for load resistance, they might be fine. They should be fine. Most people will be fine if they've had this gradual, consistent exercise loading throughout their life with lots of variety. And that of course, is the answer. Start young and maintain a variety of exercise activities.
Yeah, start young, maintain a variety of exercise activities. The shape, I presume that's analogous with the geometry of the bone. which
Yeah, that's right.
Professor Stuart Warden had shared around in the paper that they published as well, that geometry, there really is a window of opportunity to influence geometry pre-puberty, but that window maybe isn't as great into adulthood on the geometry front itself. I mean, we know that density can change, or is that...
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think we have the capacity to change our bone shape and size right throughout our life. I think what actually determines geometry is your genetic blueprint. You know, our bones grow in a certain shape because of what our genes tell them to do. Whether they get thicker in some regions is in response to the exercise and the loads that we put on them. But you would know from your time in the anatomy lab that a tibia looks pretty much the same for everybody, but you'd be surprised. I've looked at hundreds of cross-sections of tibia, and the difference in cross-sectional shape is pretty phenomenal. Normally they're a triangular shape, but they can be anything. They can be more round, they can be slightly square, and those subtle differences in the genetics of a shape of bone also almost certainly contribute to somebody's risk of greater or lesser risk of a fracture.
There's that genetic word coming back, Belinda, and I think the influence of genes. Belinda, nutrition for adolescents. We know nutrients key for bone health are calcium and vitamin D. Is there anything you'd specifically add to that? The paper cites for adolescents between 1,100, 1,300 milligrams of calcium is recommended daily. Anything you'd add to that? Would it be fair to say that in periods of steep growth that maybe the demands are greater?
Yeah. If you think about, let's say, a dry sponge, and if you put it in the bottom of the sink and you drip water on it and it begins to expand and become larger, that's how bone is growing, sort of expanding in that way. Now, if there is no calcium in that water, that sponge is going to be all soft and squishy. If there's plenty of calcium in there, then it's going to harden and be nice and healthy. So the demand for calcium increases with growth because there's more bone matrix there that needs to be mineralized. So it's really, really important to get adequate calcium during growth. And there are a few growth spurts, obviously, but certainly that one sort of from 10 through to about 14, and that covers the growth spurts of most kids, girls and boys, is really vital. The vitamin D issue is one of assisting with the absorption of calcium from the gut. So the calcium itself is needed in the bone, but the vitamin D is what helps to get the calcium out of food and into the bones. So mostly, especially in our sunny climate, we can get the vitamin D we need just from 10 minutes a day at the safe hours, not in the middle, really hot time of day, is adequate for our calcium needs to pull the calcium out of the gut. But there are some places we have to remember that our cousins down south are not as lucky. And actually, one of the recommendations I've read is that in Hobart, in the middle of winter, you need about an hour in the full sun with no sunscreen to get enough vitamin D to prevent any kind of insufficiency. So that being the case, and the fact that many people can't get that amount of sun because they're working, what they would need, it would be a supplement. It's really difficult to get vitamin D from the diet because of the sources. I mean, you find it in butter and liver and mushrooms, but it's hard to find it anywhere else. So the sun is the best source, and you just have to get your exposure at the safe hours. But as for calcium, it's the same old story. We want to get calcium from the diet. A supplement is definitely necessary for some people who can't tolerate the sources of food that we normally get calcium from. But if you can tolerate dairy, that's what you need to be eating. Milk, cheese, yogurt. Cheese is definitely a source that many people who are lactose intolerant can tolerate because the lactose is broken down a bit more.
Yeah, some great learnings there, Belinda. I guess an area it is so huge for adolescents is the hormone profile. of the developing adolescent, male or female. Clinically, I feel this is such a huge area. Obviously, we would consider the workload of the individual if a bone stress injury presents, but the hormone profile, we've touched on this in the past and featured experts in this area, but from your academic body of work, are there any key things you'd point out, things to be aware of for the developing body, male or female, in terms of hormone profile?
Well, estrogen, when it comes to bone, estrogen is king or queen. It's a hormone that tends to sit on top of the osteoclasts, which are the bone resorbing cells, and sort of clamp them a little bit and prevent them from being too active. If you don't have enough circulating estrogen, then those cells are more free to resorb more bone. The situation with athletes or other situations where people are not able to get enough food, where you have an energy imbalance, so an energy insufficiency, the body reacts by dropping the levels of circulating estrogen, and that, of course, has this effect on releasing the osteoclasts. So you don't want an energy imbalance if you're a very active person. You want to make sure that you're eating enough to meet your energy needs for what you're expending. The clue for both girls and boys is to see if you're losing weight. Now, in some cases, there may be some people who do need to lose weight. They might be exercising for that purpose and they might be on a diet, and that's okay. But if we're talking about people who have a normal body weight and they're just engaged in athletic pursuits, if you're losing weight, you're not eating enough. For girls, the biggest signal is if you lose your period, because that's a sign that your circulating estrogen is too low. So the big flags are losing weight and losing your period.
Pre-onset of menstruation cycles or menarche for female adolescents, obviously that's not a barometer they can rely on, so it's more looking at if there's a loss of weight.
That's right.
It's challenging, right? There's not much else you could go on by other than perhaps blood work, which you could monitor levels.
Yeah, and blood work is problematic because everybody is different, but I think certainly what makes it even more challenging during periods of growth is that people should be putting on weight. So if they're growing but they're not putting on weight, that's also a sign. That's essentially weight loss. If you're getting taller but you're not gaining weight. I suppose you have to keep an eye on a child's body habitus. You can see if somebody's engaged in an activity that requires a fair amount of muscle development, if they're not developing that muscle, that's probably also a sign, and it's possible they're not getting enough of the nutrients they require to do that. But in the sports where presentation is a focus, so we're talking ballet, figure skating, gymnastics, this is where there is a real focus on leanness. And so coaches and parents have to be ever vigilant that some sort of bad eating behaviours don't creep in. And certainly, it's not really my area, but I do have come across this quite a bit. The bulimia is probably the biggest problem in this area because oftentimes the athletes don't really lose a lot of weight, but by purging, they're not getting the nutrients that they should be. So they might be binging on foods that are not appropriate and then throwing up, but they're throwing up the good with the bad. So, it's definitely a fraught issue. It's not all that common, but as I say, it's definitely more common in the presentation sports, so people have to be ultra vigilant.
You're listening to Professor Belinda Beck, founder of the Bone Clinic and the award-winning Onero exercise program for osteoporosis, sharing around bone stress injuries in adolescent athletes. If you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode that has garnered a lot of interest, and for good reason. Alistair Brownlee, dual Olympic triathlon champion from 2012 and 2016, shared around his career highs, lows and learnings. Here's a little snippet of Alistair's sharings.
triathlon is effectively an efficiency sport. I need to be able to get to the last K and then win races in the last K. To do that, I need to be efficient. To be efficient, you need to do large amounts of exercise. If you can do that at a low intensity, and that doesn't have, if that has the same benefits as a little bit of a higher intensity, you do it at a low intensity, and that allows you to do your hard stuff as hard as you can. And as long as you protect your hard sessions in the week and you protect them, you should basically do as much volume outside that as you possibly can fit in.
So if you happen to miss the full episode featuring Alistair Brownlee, MBE, jump back to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from. You'll find the show now over on YouTube as well. Whilst there, check out the archives dating all the way back to episode 1, featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition guest, Professor Belinda Beck, founder of the Bone Clinic, self-confessed scientific mythbuster, sharing around bone stress injuries in the adolescent athlete. It was in the public domain, but our Australian great swimmer Emily Seebohm, she came out and mentioned that she'd been struggling with bulimia as an elite swimmer for the aesthetic side, and you wouldn't necessarily equate swimming as a leanness sport, although it is. But I certainly see issues with this as well, Belinda, in the running community and the triathlon community, and it's leanness sports also. It's a challenging time, and throw in there the social pressures on developing bodies that we now have with social media. It is a key time for parents and care teams of these individuals to be around and be aware of.
I think the kinds of foods that are available these days, such high density caloric content, cheap and available and delicious, and the temptation is so great. Back in the day when there was no such thing as McDonald's, I look at photographs from my high school and you were hard-pressed to find an overweight kid. And that's because we just ate what was available. If you're lucky, you got a Mars bar. But the availability of these high-density calorie foods, and a lot of them are marketed as health foods. So definitely the consults with nutritionists and dietitians who know what they're talking about can help guide athletes into the direction of foods that, you don't have to be a nun. You can eat some junk every now and again, but you have to make sure that the good is predominates and that there's not a sense that your appearance is the primary issue here. Your health is the primary issue.
And it's just ironic that low energy availability, yes, it affects health so greatly, but the very thing sometimes that drives people to restrict on calories is hopeful performance gains. Yet we know so clearly that performance deficits are a result of low energy availability as well. So it just makes no sense.
Yeah, and we often think that this is limited to female sports, but as you mentioned, there are many other sports that are affected, and particularly distance cycling. You see a lot of emaciated endurance cyclists, and these guys are not getting adequate nutrition, and their bones, as a result, are terrible.
Gosh. Belinda, the conclusion of this narrative review into bone stress injury risk and management for adolescents was this, and that is that there is some evidence that I'm reading here that adolescent athletes are at greater risk of bone stress injuries, including stress fractures, than their adult counterparts. However, minimal empirical data are available specific to pediatric risk factors, diagnosis, management, prevention. In the absence of such evidence, yourself and Louise Drysdale site, we have extrapolated from the adult condition and from what is known about strategies to optimize pediatric bone health. So I think, as you've outlined there, it's applying principles known through adulthood and managing bone stress injuries in adulthood, plus prevention strategies, and trying to do the best. Is there anything else you'd add, or any advice you'd give to the parent out there of their child that's hell for leather into their sporting pursuit to try and help them steward their bone health across their lifespan?
Well, I suppose trying to give them a balanced view of health across the lifespan, because if they do want to be the best in their sport, this is, if you pardon the pun, it's a marathon, not a sprint, unless they're a sprinter. It's for the long term, and the only way to perform at your best is to be your most healthy. So you find a training strategy and an eating strategy and a social strategy that suits you and is the most healthy and allows for periods of rest, and you stick with it. And along the way, it's probably important to make sure that there is a variety of exercise in the same way as a variety of foods in your diet, but a variety is going to make your skeleton the strongest it could possibly be. And you definitely want to make sure that you load it up from the earliest age, gradually, right through into your 20s, because that's the period where you're developing your peak bone mass.
Brilliant. So just being wary of that early specialisation, and it can be a trap. Expose children to multiple different activities and try and include that habit into adulthood as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Professor Belinda Beck, every guest of the show, you're a repeat guest, is asked two set questions, and way back 200 episodes ago, I know you did issue a physical challenge that involved stairs, but is there a specific physical challenge you'd deploy on this episode for this particular topic, adolescence and minimising bone stress injuries?
A specific challenge?
Physical challenge.
That's a really hard one, Brad.
You stumped me many times, Professor Belinda Beck, when I was in class. I'm returning the favour.
Well, look, I think I'm not sure that there is such a thing, to be quite honest. I'd throw it back at you and say there are strategies to prevent injury that you should carry throughout life. And the primary one is listen to your body.
Great. Listen to your body.
If you can feel on a bone a very sore spot, that is a very bad sign. And that is a number one reason to stop what you're doing, let your bones catch up, give at least a week, probably two, of some other form of training, not loading that, and then just pick up at a lower rate of training and reintroduce at a slower rate to prevent it happening again. And ultimately, if you can do that once, where you really control the loading over time, you'll probably avoid having one ever again. But it's that first time you notice it, you've got to manage it properly. Otherwise, you're going to be plagued throughout your career if you just ignore it and try and run through.
Yeah. I say clinically we have zero tolerance for bone pain. It is not a soft tissue that you've got a bit of greyness around. If there's pain with bones, you have to take heed of that, deload it, get diagnosed, and then look at potential reasons why it's occurred, and do that thoroughly. Multidisciplinary care with this is so key. I thought you were going to throw the challenge back on me, and I had one prepared, and that is consider a dietetic review for every high outputting young adolescent. I just think it's perhaps one of the greatest investments we could make in our kids that are out there so active all the time. It's just making sure that, I think every parent's quite precious, understandably, that they're feeding their child enough, but it's not always about it. The quantity, it's the quality, it's the density, as you say, meeting those demands, which I think are hard to quantify. And if anything, we possibly always come a little bit under fueling.
Yeah. That's quite true, and I love that idea. And anything you gain from a dietitian consult for an athlete child is going to pay off in spades for the benefit of the rest of your family.
Yeah, brilliant. Professor Belinda Beck, you're always so generous with your time and knowledge. Thank you for your contribution to the space of bone, the interaction of bone and exercise. I never thought it would shape my practice as much as it has. When I was sitting there as a student, I know I mentioned that to Amy Harding prior. Life's funny like that. You've got a lot on the go, a lot of academic work, continual papers. The Bone Clinic is there, the Onero online program. Can you just touch on those briefly? Because these are great additions to the space for people that want to improve their knowledge and perhaps improve their own skeletons.
Yeah, the Bone Clinic is a translational research facility where we've rolled out one of our really successful exercise interventions for osteoporosis into the real world. So people who have concerns with their skeletons, and mostly it's older people with osteoporosis, but we do have quite a number of younger people, particularly young female athletes, who come to us and they do our Onero program. The Onero program can be delivered by physios and exercise physiologists beyond the walls of the bone clinic because we've licensed the product. So there's an online training platform and they just need to contact me if they want to deliver it in their own clinic. And we've got about 30 people around Australia already doing that.
Yeah, brilliant. And we can find you on Twitter, Belinda R. Beck. And there you post photos of kangaroos going down the street occasionally.
That's right.
Thank you again, Belinda. Certainly wish you all the best for the rest of the year.
Thanks, Brad.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show. And I trust and I know you enjoyed Professor Belinda Beck's share-ins. If you did, you can find Belinda over on Twitter at Belinda R. Beck, or jump on to ResearchGate, any scientific database, and there you'll find the plethora of Professor Belinda Beck's scientific work. If you'd like to find out more about the Bone Clinic or the award-winning exercise program for osteoporosis, Onero, then jump online, simply Google the Bone Clinic or Onero, O-N-E-R-O, and there you'll have your results. Keep the posies coming, team. They are a screenshot of the episode that you've been enjoying and tagging in the show on social at Physical Performance Show. If you have any feedback about improving the show, you can reach out to me at Brad_beer on socials or via email b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. A massive thanks to this week's show sponsor, Polar. If you are in the market for a new GPS watch or heart rate monitor, you cannot go past Polar. Remember, you can receive up to 15% off selected products over at polar.com by using the code TPPS. Now, a huge thank you to this week's new show patrons, Gay Rutherford and Lizzie Van Dongen. Thank you for your support of the show. Now, if you'd like to become a Patreon Learnings member, it's simple. Jump over to patreon.com, search for the Physical Performance Show, and there from just $5 per month, you can support not only the production of the show, but in return will grant you access to our back catalogue of live stream events and our upcoming live stream events, including October 23rd's Fueling the Endurance Athlete live stream with Rinny McGregor, UK-based sports dietitian. As always, a massive thank you to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep the learnings coming as we feature US-based running researcher Max Paquette, former guest of the show. This time, Max is back to discuss the ins and outs of surface interactions for the runner. There's a long-held belief that softer surfaces must confer less injuries and less load on the body. However, is that a reality? Here's a little snippet of what you'll enjoy next week.
There is a risk of maybe rolling your ankle and then contributing to the damage of the bone, potentially, depending on how you do it or, what's happening. The other thing is that, muscle forces contribute to loading a bone, right? Compressing a bone and even bending the bone a little bit. There's some good research on some modeling studies that are able to model the amount of compressive force being applied to a bone and how much of that compressive force comes from the muscles themselves, the muscle tension pulling the bones, essentially.
So be sure to be tuning in to next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.